So I was discussing the now fairly wide controversy surrounding narrative devices going against gameplay mechanics in contemporary video games with my brother when he made the interesting statement that the concept of non-interactive cinematics did not hold the same negative connotations to him as it appears to generally do in video game audiences currently. Instead, he would be prompted to consider the cinematics of many games from the late 80s to the early 2000s, where technical limitations forced developers to use minimalistic or otherwise largely abstract aesthetics during core gameplay. Because other mediums would adhere to different restrictions than interactive real-time rendered environments, live action or animated styles would be utilized in cinematics to offer different interpretations of the same universe as not possible, or at the very least not very conveniently done through the visuals of the in-game environments alone. It's notable that this was mostly a passing trend though. When video games at large entered the realms of the fully 3D rendered environments, it not only became possible, but the more practical choice to just use in-game assets for cinematics. Why spend precious time and resources animating distinct and stylized cinematics when they can be cheaper, quicker, and equally competently made, using in-game assets which have already been created? While it most certainly wasn't the first title to do this, I remember seeing in marketing material for Medal of Honor Airborne how impressed the developers apparently were with the in-game first-person cinematics. I showed that video, but it's nowhere to be found on the internet, and Medal of Honor Airborne really wants me to complete the game before I can actually watch it in the extra materials section. Along with this, my only significant save progress is in the hardest difficulty, so please enjoy this footage of me failing perpetually instead. Anyways, the point they made that I want to resign with something along the lines of "you'll actually be there from start to finish," and it referenced how the cinematics in the game were sometimes shot in first person and meant to transition fluently from and into gameplay without any cuts or fading into black. One of the consequences of emphasizing this sort of fluidity is that apart from camera movement and maybe animation work, without any fancy filters, cinematics and gameplay would often have a very uniform aesthetic since both use the same graphical assets. Another issue which sometimes arises is that the endeavor of making seamless transitions between cinematics and gameplay often acts as a justification for having no comprehensible rules for when cinematics, QTEs or other barely interactive segments are allowed to be placed, resulting in gameplay rules which aren't transparent to the player or unexpectedly change for no apparent reason. This largely wasn't the case with most games in the aforementioned period, because the underlying technology in a lot of genres at the time required heavy segregation of cinematics and gameplay mechanics. In certain genres like the graphical adventure game though, interactivity was usually sufficiently limited and slowly paced that cinematics and gameplay were allowed to mostly blend into one another, with neither taking clear precedence over the other.
Where did you get that robot?
I built him. Like it?
It's crap, son.
Along with this, cinematics were often expensive to produce, and many RPGs, for instance, relied much more heavily upon text and mainly reserved expensive and time-consuming cinematics for critical moments in their narratives, like intros, upon advancement into new major areas, upon the beginning and end of chapters, and upon completion of the game. By this point, it's probably important to note that in combining different forms of media into one finished work is by no means any new concept. Using text and at least one form of imagery to support a common point has been used for about as long as any written language has existed, and many forms of visual media require some pretty hefty amounts of creativity if they decide to include no words at all, video games included. Almost all video games and movies feature some form of dialogue which necessitates subtitles for practical purposes, as some audiences will inevitably have an easier time deciphering text than vocal audio in a foreign language.
Чтоб дымок был. Ведь кто же кроме тебя звезды-то считать будет?
It's also not uncommon to include at least some form of diegetic visual artwork, which establishes or reinforces the ideology and culture of any fictional society depicted within the work, be it architecture, propaganda posters, craftsmanship, technology, essentially anything which can be analyzed as a product of a society existing within that fictional world. Suffice to say, multimedia is commonly used within most forms of media, and it can be used in many layers, be it for practical, diegetic, stylistic, or in the case of games, mechanical purposes. This doesn't mean it's always used in a very interesting way though. Intentional genre breaking in mechanical design is still as frequent a phenomena as I'd ever expect it to be within the video game industry, but I don't really recall anything but the absolute most obscure of recent titles doing it aesthetically. From the 80s to the early 2000s, the segregation of cinematics from core gameplay and their frequent role as introductions to game worlds meant that they sometimes looked radically different from the actual game. With the ever-present aim of catching the player's attention right from the get-go, video game cinematics would often be expensive CGI animations or full-motion video, which in most cases today has aged to the point of achieving cult status for its cheesy appearance, but it also usually did succeed regardless in at least making something stylistically interesting. And in some cases, highly stylized animated cinematics were attempted, the like of which were almost exclusive to that period. Looking-Glass Studios' Thief the Dark Project and Thief 2 The Metal Age may be almost unfair examples, as the cinematics definitely aren't really representative of any writer tendency during this period. They demonstrate a capability and creativity that I've seen in few other games of that time, or of any other time for that matter. Some extremely impressive sound design and the writing of the fictional hymns, scriptures, songs and other forms of text used for world building honestly took me by surprise when I started playing the series a couple of years ago.
When I was very young, Paris took me away from the boundary mother and said, "Thou art the child of my endeavors. Follow me and thou shalt inherit the earth."
The legendary Fallout series exhibits similar qualities, but when it comes to the subject of this presentation, both of those examples do have reasonably uniform aesthetics, despite how interesting and perfected their respective aesthetics may be. Because another thing I find extremely interesting is when radically different aesthetics can be used to interpret the same universe. A really great example would be the utilization of the live-action mission briefings of the early Command & Conquer games. In defiance of the general trend regarding using live-action footage in video games, they've admirably remained in use throughout the series up until today, although arguably as much more of a tradition or ritual established by the earlier game rather than a considerable aesthetic choice. Certain cutscenes and marketing materials in Red Alert 3, for instance, imply that wackiness and hot soldier babes are now apparently the primary selling points of the series. I mean, what the fuck is this even supposed to? In its earlier forms, however, it results in a situation where an introduction sequence would look something like this.
Nod forces have fortified this beachhead at X-16Y42. Intelligence is still coming in, so we can't tell you a lot.
While the in-game graphics look like this. There's something I find kind of fascinating about using visual styles that look this different to represent the same fictional universe. The mission briefings also served a very practical purpose in the early games. They would feature short monologues and dialogues, usually spoken by senior officers, meant to provide the player with a context to the missions they participate in throughout the game, along with providing the game with a substantial narrative which probably wouldn't be easily achieved using the abstract, heavily pixelated graphics seen in-game alone. It's ironic that Command & Conquer Generals would actually later do exactly this. It relied primarily on voiceovers during the game's loading screens to provide mission details, but otherwise upon non-interactive cutscenes using in-game assets for its exposition, even despite the low polygon count of its models and the low resolution of its textures, barely allowing for any more detailed expression than any previous title in the series. The radically different look of the cinematics in Command & Conquer as opposed to the look of the in-game missions conveys to the player that the game isn't to be interpreted only as an interactive competition. It's not a flat playing board, it's a real environment and you're a real military commander. Using a different medium or even just showing images or showing the world through a different lens or just from a different angle than what's possible in-game can show the player how they're supposed to interpret what's going on the screen, no matter how abstract it might be. This is one of the reasons as to why arcade machines, creatively designed user manuals, and box art can be so significant in video games despite existing outside of the software itself. It can provide different angles or spins on how the related game worlds can look, sound or feel using mediums with different restrictions than the environments in-game. to the point where playing the game without them offers a definitively less complete experience. One of the most radical examples of real objects supporting fictional works may very well be the concept of in-game objects recreated as merchandise. Rather than just portraying a part of a fictional world through a different genre or different medium, the sort of merchandise instead takes a usually tiny but stylistically significant portion of a fictional world and translates it into an actual physical, tangible relic or souvenir of sorts that fans can purchase and hold in their hands for themselves, and use as either a memory or a display of affection for its world of origin. This is much the case with the Septem, which came with the collector's edition of Oblivion. While my feelings on Oblivion are extremely mixed, the Septem itself is an embodiment of qualities which are expressed in the series rather than only in Oblivion, which means that pretty much any fan of the Elder Scrolls universe should be able to appreciate it. My brother noted that using a replica of the form of currency used in a fictional universe as merchandise is in general a pretty good idea, because it oftentimes tells a lot about said universe, hinting at the form of culture and the form of economic/power structure in place. It's one of the reasons as to why the bottle caps in Fallout and the bullets in Metro 2033 are so significant to their respective universes. The bottle caps display the absurdist tragicomic approach to world building in Fallout, and hints at a tribal society holding objects which today are considered almost completely worthless as valuable artifacts. And the bullets display the equally tragic but more survivalistic, humanistic approach in Metro. It's very difficult not to interpret any humanistic message from a universe in which the economy is literally based upon the means of killing other people. The Septem itself shows that the world it's from is one of feudal imperialism. It shows that this society is a religious, polytheistic one, and that one of their primary deities is Akatosh, depicted as a dragon. It shows the look and feel of their metalwork, and the details and craftsmanship of the coin itself pronounces the capability of this society. Anyways, there are two other forms of media which aren't often used with any significant thematic purpose, but which I nonetheless believe hold a lot of potential when done right. And those are maps and statistics. Both are rarely seen as forms of media holding vast creative potential, and their presence in video games as such is often caused by either convenience or mechanical necessity. When a player has to navigate environments covering huge areas of virtual landmass, they become extremely difficult to navigate without some form of navigation tools, and refusing to include some form of map without giving sufficient justification would probably be seen as downright insulting by players. They become near unavoidable in many strategy games, since core gameplay in most cases takes place in an environment which resembles a map, but in most others, maps act as separate menus or small radars of sorts, mainly existing to negate the likelihood of the player getting lost. In games where mechanical complexity is achieved by having the player manage complex organisms, like entire societies or large-scale armies, it would probably likewise result in some pretty extreme compromises, or some extremely creative design becoming necessary if the developers refuse to communicate important variables through at least some form of statistics. But both can also be used extremely effectively as significant narrative devices or thematic primers. While there's almost certainly better examples out there, especially in the many strategy games which primarily base their mechanics around concepts which are presented using statistics. To save time, I'm going to use a couple of examples which don't use statistics in their core gameplay but more as narrative punctuation. One of those is Station 37, a very short and pretty obscure indie platforming game about fighting fires, and I'd really recommend playing it and skipping forward by clicking the link provided for now, if you in any way is interested, as it's quite an interesting little experiment which will probably lose its value completely if explained like I'll do now. You see, Station 37 is a game about fighting fires, and the core mechanics taught to the player at the beginning are based around that concept. The player assumes the role of a masked firefighter, selects a level from a Super Mario Bros. 3-esque map screen, and then navigates around a flaming apartment building to rescue a set number of people rendered unconscious by smoke inhalation. The player uses a fire axe to break down doors and a fire extinguisher for putting out fires, jumping their way over flaming chasms in the process. This only resumes until the player rescues the fine person in the top level of the building though, As the roof with no prior warning and with no intentions of stopping the game to emphasize any change blows apart, revealing the town in the background to be undergoing a full-scale extraterrestrial invasion. No significant change to aesthetic and no heavy narrative exposition follows, aside from the music and environments changing as the cityscape is gradually assimilated into a strange alien wasteland. But the gameplay is now completely recontextualized as the player uses the same tools as before to fight off invading aliens rather than fires. The player eventually fights their way back to the fire station, defeats a giant creature wearing a fire truck and some stolen firefighter helmets, until a conclusional absurdist punchline appears. Congratulations, mankind is being exterminated, you saved somewhere between 2 and 6 people. The casualties count in Xenonauts, essentially a remake and spiritual successor to XCOM UFO Defense, paints an equally grim picture of the extraterrestrial invasion. If UFOs are left roaming the geoscape, which they will until the very late game, they'll sometimes affect people's everyday lives in the form of small news pop-ups that the player can read. These range from UFO sightings to missing cattle to weather changes to missing people, to attacks on military forces, to terror attacks on passenger ships and crowded urban areas, like malls and stadiums. It's conveyed through short phrases and through numbers, but the meaning behind those numbers is a very grim one and serves to help increase tensions, as the number of civilians and under-equipped military personnel killed during the invasion spirals into the thousands and then the 10,000s, the 100,000s and the millions. In regards to the potential of maps, how well it can work ties in closely with what's depicted and what's left vague enough to allow the player's imagination to flourish. If done correctly, a well-designed and well-utilized map can spark the player's curiosity or evoke discomfort by providing only vague cues of what to anticipate. Take the first area of Resident Evil 4 for instance. The narrow pathways and small enclosed farms and houses with a few semi-open areas set the standard for a level design which, despite taking place outdoors, evokes claustrophobia and unease just like the environments of its predecessors. Then you look at the map and see that there's one area which totally breaks this pattern. A gigantic open area. It's very clear that something bad is probably going to happen there, but it's left up to the player to find out what exactly once the way to it has been unlocked. How well a map evokes unease or curiosity is also connected to the quality of the level design it depicts, along with what kind of level is depicted in the first place. The simulationistic level design of Resident Evil 1 and 2, for instance, results in the map also looking heavily simulationistic. Some of the qualities of the environmental design are shared. As such, it can also end up providing massive spoilers of what to expect when mishandled. For instance, in Morrowind, a map of the entire game world is available right from the beginning, but only as an entirely brown, mostly featureless mess, which only displays the very general shape and outlines of Vvardenfell. Detailed terrain features, important landmarks and towns are only added to the map as the player explores, which is a pretty good way of keeping the game's diverse set of environments and architectural marvels a surprise until players get out there and discover them for themselves. In Oblivion, the environments are only represented by vague drawings, as it instead seeks to look like an actual map, brown and mostly limited on details, with handwritten notes and only small icons used to display the location of important landmarks. While I find that the environments Oblivion has to discover are significantly more underwhelming than Morrowind, it at least doesn't spoil much of the layout of the map from the get-go. This is however exactly the case with Skyrim's world map. Throwing away any pretense of diegetic artifice, in Skyrim you just press the map button and off you fly into the stratosphere for a neat eye-candy heavy overview. However, while important landmarks are still mostly restricted to being depicted as icons, the landscapes of the land itself are depicted with low polygon counts but otherwise very accurately. What kind of environments that are in store for the player is showcased mostly from the beginning, and demonstrates a couple of somewhat reoccurring problems multiple areas of the game's design suffer from, providing unnecessary information too early on and in the process also ironically treating this information as completely unremarkable. Depending on especially the wording used to name different landmarks, maps can also help pique the player's curiosity By providing enough information to create a consistent and distinct geographical layout and hint at what kind of place it is, but vague enough to leave it all as implications, and otherwise let the viewer's imagination run relatively free. As a fan of Morrowind, looking at the ridiculously ambitious map of the Tamriel Rebuild project is pretty hype-inducing. I know enough about Morrowind to know that the fishing hamlets of Vardenfell are quaint, the House Veteran Council Hall is a sight to behold, and the sacred city of Vivek is an architectural marvel beyond anything else the island has to offer. But I can also easily look at the online interactive map of mainland Morrowind and see that the capital cities of Mournhold and Almalexia dwarf Vivek both in sheer size and likely also population count and architectural grandeur. Bethesda pulled out a pretty smart move by making the expansion pack Tribunal set in Mournhold. While the landmass is obviously a tiny DLC-sized area compared to Vardenfell, and also pretty small compared to Blood Moon, focusing just on this area allowed the team to work on a single population center with architecture which both feels fresh and exotic while also feeling much more intimidating than almost anything seen on Vardenfell. It provides the player with an extremely immediate sense of scale. So if Mournhold alone can evoke these feelings, how magnificent must the surrounding city of Almalexia, as well as the other great cities of Blacklight, Necrom, Narsis and Tyr be to surpass the settlements of Vardenfell? How grand must the farmlands which feed such population centers be? How well a map works thematically is also dependent on whether it exists purely as a practical tool or if it's supposed to be interpreted as diegetic. The latter is the case in Thief the Dark Project and Thief 2 the Metal Age, and there's probably a point as to why they are often shown in the intro cinematics in some levels. Just like previously mentioned, they help as narrative primers, hinting at what kind of challenges lie ahead. This is especially because their status as diegetic means that the information they provide in some levels is either cripplingly vague or downright misleading, depending on what kind of area the level takes place in and whether it's an area which is easy to obtain information about. The player is always made aware of this in the intro, so it doesn't come off as a confusing or frustrating surprise. To elaborate, in some of the levels, parts of the environments depicted on the maps are marked with question marks or are left completely blank, and the design is also purposefully vague in showing the player where they are, only highlighting the general area of their position. And in one of the levels, the protagonist has to venture into a part of town which has been abandoned for about half a century. While it's explained in the intro cinematic of that level that maps of the area are easy to obtain, all of them are horribly outdated and depicts the area as it looked before it was abandoned. As such, there are places where the map is downright misleading, and the player is prompted to learn how to find their way around the area as it looks now by themselves. This shows that maps, when used creatively, can actively act as supportive to other mechanics, like player-based exploration, by providing general information about areas but also requiring the player to question their validity at times, and instead find their own way around. So yeah, the creative use of multimedia in games can be extremely interesting at times. Closing off, I'm well aware that the structure of my video here might be slightly messy, partially due to my self-imposed time restrictions and partially because this is one of the first articles I've written specifically to be accompanied by video. I also hope that my inexperience with speaking English and my inexperience with speaking in general wasn't too much of a hindrance and that you managed to enjoy the video nonetheless. I also hope that it doesn't come across too much as nostalgia whoring, because none of the design elements discussed here are really things that I hold much emotional attachment to, as much as I just think it's interesting to think about and funny to look at when it's actually in front of you. Maybe I would like to see more games in which stylistic coherence doesn't necessarily absolve from including intelligent use of paradoxical or jarring genres or mediums, or at least from emphasizing more of the mediums included once they're actually there. Or maybe such things are already being made and I'm just not looking in the right places or something. Either way, I know that cinematics in general have earned a severely negative reputation in some audiences, especially due to their horrible misuse when developers try to force traditional Hollywood conventions onto interactive media. But once something vibrating with as much excessive creative energy as this is what I have to sit through for exposition and world building, then I don't think I'll have any problem swallowing whatever your fictional world has to offer raw.
Hello, Mr. Cooks. Hello, Mr. Cooks.